But I wanted to ask you a question as well about Syria, which was that if you had to predict what you think will happen with Syria, say there's peace talks and they actually invite all the different opposition groups to join them, how do you see Syria being carved up, or is it just going to be a perpetual conflict? I mean, or could we have a kind of Alawite sort of coastal strip and then going around towards Damascus, Hezbollah goes back to Lebanon, and then you have sort of IS out in the desert like you talked about, and a sort of Kurdish autonomous area? What do you think is going to happen?
Well, it's obviously very difficult to predict, and I hesitate to do that. But I would say this much: I would be extremely surprised if the Syrian problem is solved by negotiations in Geneva. I would be stunned by that. In fact, as the negotiations go on, the Syrians are doing what they're doing with the Russians in Aleppo. I mean, they're actually changing the face of the battle as the negotiations continue, putting the rebels in a more or less impossible position. So I cannot see how how negotiations create a peaceful resolution. But the war will eventually create some kind of draw, some kind of point where the parties find the continuation of fighting too costly. Rather rest with what you've got than continue to fight. And we may very well be approaching a point where we're nearly there. Where if Assad has the coastal area and he has the control of the cities, and the area along the Golan is held by rebels who are not ISIS, or by forces that are not engaged in any hostility towards Israel. And Israel and whoever controls southern Syria and Jordan don't let the Iranians and Hezbollah establish this front along the Golan, and we will let it be, then you have a de facto carving up of Syria into Assad's region, which is the cities and the Alawi area, the Kurdish area along the border with Turkey. ISIS has the desert and the eastern part, and the southern part, the triangle Israel, Golan, Jordan, is controlled by forces that are not hostile either to Jordan or to Israel. We can live with that. And I would imagine that others would too. And I think we are, and ISIS represents that. I mean, ISIS is a very interesting political organization. ISIS threatens the integrity of the old colonial state order in two ways. On the one hand, it provokes these sectarian identities that lead to the breakup of states. But ISIS also represents the caliphate uniting different parts of the Sunni world. So the border between Iraq and Syria doesn't exist anymore. And they're actually breaking up Syria and Iraq, but also uniting parts of Syria and Iraq. So on the one hand, it's supranational. And on the other hand, it's subnational. But in both ways, they're breaking up the old state order. I don't see the old state order being recreated, but something which is a combination of the Ottoman Empire recognizing sectarian identities and the new nation states, where the Fertile Crescent, that is that area from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean, will look more like Lebanon. Interestingly, if you look at what has happened over the last few years, Lebanon, which was supposed to have disintegrated a long time ago, didn't. And Syria and Iraq, that were these stable states, have disintegrated. So why didn't Lebanon fall apart as it was supposed to? The reason is that Lebanon was never created as an Arab state. Lebanon from the very beginning was created as a confederation of minorities, French style. The state had a very weak central government from the very beginning, And political power in Lebanon was divided between the sectarian communities on the basis of their relative sizes, what they called confessionalism, ta'ifiyya in Arabic. This is what they should do in Iraq. This is what they should do in Syria. It's not pluralism, Western style, based on individuals and politics, but pluralism based on groups. The peoples of the Middle East, traditionally, are not societies of individuals, but societies of groups. People belong to groups. And their membership in their group is of greater importance than their individuality. It's very well known. And many people in the West find this quite abhorrent, but it is a custom nevertheless. What are called honor killings, where men in families can kill their sisters if they are seen to behave in a manner which is offensive to the family. The family values are superior to her individual rights. And people in the region, and this is how Ottoman politics were organized, all belonged to sects, tribes, families, and extended families. The idea that people's collective identity was defined by the language they spoke or the territory that they inhabited is Western and foreign. People in the Middle East for centuries upon centuries have defined themselves by their religious belief. You are either a Muslim or something else. And therefore, Middle Eastern peoples have tended to be far more loyal to their sectarian, traditional identities. And as the state has weakened, so these sectarian identities have been reinforced. Lebanon was ahead of the game. And this has to do, I won't go into it now, but it has to do with the different ways in which the French and the British understood the Middle East. The British regarded the Middle East as the Arab world. The British were great believers in Arab nationalism. The French never were. And therefore the French established Lebanon as this mosaic of minorities, whereas the British established Iraq as an Arab state, where the Shiites, the majority in Iraq, never regarded themselves as Arab nationalists. The Shiites always suspected that Arab nationalism was a Sunni game, used to suppress the Shiites, which it was. And the British saw the Arab nationalists as their potential allies. So the British went along with Arab nationalism, which essentially in the long run failed. And what has re-emerged is these sectarian identities, which are, I would argue, much more historically real than Arab nationalism ever was.